In a small African village surrounded by tall baobab trees and endless stretches of golden grassland, a girl was born who would one day be known as the keeper of the golden voice. From the very moment she cried as a newborn, the people of the village paused in awe. Her cry was unlike any other, gentle yet strong, carrying with it a strange warmth that settled deep in the hearts of those who heard it. Mothers stopped their work to listen, elders lifted their heads as though an ancient memory had been stirred, and even the restless animals around the village seemed to grow quiet. No one could explain it, but everyone agreed that this child's voice carried something beyond the ordinary. Her parents named her Amara, which meant grace, for they believed that grace itself had chosen to live inside her. As she grew, her gift became more undeniable. When the skies darkened and heavy winds threatened to tear through the fields, Amara would hum softly, and the storm would hesitate, circling the village but never daring to destroy it. When children fell and hurt themselves, her lullabies would soothe their cries and ease their pain, as if the wounds themselves listened and chose to heal faster. The elders whispered that her voice was blessed by the ancestors, a song carried from the spirit world into the living. Her presence became the heart of the village, for whenever quarrels broke out, it was Amara's songs that ended them. Husbands and wives who had turned their backs on each other found themselves weeping and reconciling when they heard her sing. Friends who had become enemies found their hands reaching out for forgiveness after her melodies filled the air. It was said that her songs could stitch broken hearts back together, that her voice was a river washing away bitterness and planting seeds of peace. The villagers came to depend on her voice, not in a way that burdened her, but in reverence, as though they understood that this gift was not hers alone but belonged to all of them. She sang during harvest to bless the crops, and the fields seemed greener and richer than ever before. She sang when the cattle were led to graze, and they returned with bellies full and coats shining as though polished by sunlight. At night, when fires burned low and shadows danced on the walls of their huts, Amara's songs became the lullabies of the entire village. Even those who were restless or plagued with fears found sleep swiftly when her voice carried across the night. Yet, though her voice brought joy and comfort to others, Amara herself remained humble. She never sought recognition or praise. When villagers thanked her, she would simply smile and say, "It is not my voice alone, it is the voice of the land, the spirits and the people carried through me." The elders often gathered in secret meetings, discussing whether Amara was destined for something greater beyond their borders. Some believed she was meant to be a priestess who could guide entire kingdoms, while others feared that if word spread too far, greedy rulers or dark-hearted men might try to claim her for themselves. Still, no matter the debates, no one could deny that she was a blessing they had never seen before. Her voice became the thread that wove the village together. Children grew up learning to trust that when Amara sang they would be safe. The old found comfort in knowing they would leave the world with her melodies soothing them toward the ancestors. The young men, who often tested their strength in competition, grew calmer and more respectful when her songs reminded them that strength without kindness was empty. Even the women, burdened with endless chores and responsibilities, felt lighter when Amara's voice drifted through the air like a breeze, carrying away their fatigue. As years passed, travelers began to hear whispers of the girl with the golden voice. Merchants who stopped by the village carried tales with them, saying, "There is a girl whose voice heals, whose songs tame storms." Some dismissed it as superstition, but others grew curious and more strangers arrived to hear her. Those who were fortunate enough to witness her voice left in awe, unable to find words to describe what they had experienced. It was not just beauty, it was power, a sacred force that seemed to hold the balance of life itself. Amara's fame spread slowly but surely, and though her village protected her, they too knew that destiny had its eyes on her. She was no ordinary girl. She was a gift born not just for them but for the world. And as her voice grew stronger, so too did the sense that the peace she created within the village was only the beginning of a far greater story waiting to unfold. The king's court was a place of grandeur and spectacle, where power was measured not only by the swords of soldiers but also by the ability to command the hearts of people. This king, who had ruled for years, was known for his wealth, his vast armies and his ability to inspire fear. Yet for all his might there was one thing he lacked, the genuine love of his people. His subjects obeyed him out of duty and fear, but whispers often spread through the kingdom that their hearts did not truly belong to him. He was a ruler of command, not of devotion. It was in this fragile balance that word reached him of a girl in a small village whose voice carried something beyond beauty, it carried power. Messengers and travelers who had heard her sing spoke of her voice as though it were touched by the gods. They said that when she sang, quarrels ceased, when she lifted her melodies, children who wept grew quiet, and even the winds softened to listen. For a ruler whose reign depended on strength and fear, this was not news to be taken lightly. At first, the king scoffed, dismissing the talk as mere exaggeration. But as more people came to his palace with tales of her miraculous gift, a shadow began to grow in his heart. He began to wonder if this girl's voice, though unarmed, could be more dangerous than the sharpest blade. His advisors, ever eager to keep their place secure, noticed the doubt in his expression and sought to fuel it. "My king," one whispered, "power comes in many forms. A voice that can bend hearts can just as easily bend loyalty. If the people grow to love her more than you, will your crown not tremble?" Another added, "Your throne rests upon obedience. But if this girl sings louder than your commands, she will draw the people to her as moths to a flame. A kingdom cannot have two centers of devotion, and if it must choose, it may not choose you." The king, though proud, was not foolish. He knew that a threat to his throne did not always come with swords and shields. It could come silently, with the sound of a song that reached deeper than his decrees ever could. The thought gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night. In his dreams, he imagined standing before his people, giving a speech, only to find their eyes drifting away, their hearts tuned not to his words but to the distant sound of her voice. Envy began to take root, twisting within him like a vine choking the strength of a tree. He thought of his own voice, strong, commanding but harsh, carrying no warmth. He realized that when he spoke, obedience followed but not joy. When she sang, joy bloomed and peace spread. The more he dwelled on this, the more the jealousy festered until admiration turned to resentment. He began to ask more about the girl, ordering his spies to learn every detail of her life. Who were her parents? How did she live? Did she use her gift freely or did she guard it? Each answer only deepened his unease. The villagers, they said, adored her. When she sang at dusk, the whole village would gather as if to worship. Farmers returned from the fields with lighter steps, mothers hushed their children with promises of her evening song, and even elders claimed her voice carried memories of the ancestors. The king could not bear it. He began to see her as a rival, though she had never lifted a finger against him. To his twisted mind, her very existence threatened the foundation of his reign. His advisors continued their poison, feeding him with visions of rebellion. "Today they gather in her village," one said, bowing low. "Tomorrow they may gather before your palace, calling her queen instead of you. Better to silence her now," another hissed, "before her voice grows so loud that it cannot be silenced." The king, consumed by envy, began to plot. He envisioned stripping her of her power, breaking her gift so that her voice could no longer sway hearts. But beneath his desire for control lay a hidden fear, the fear that even if he silenced her, her memory would linger, her absence more powerful than her presence. Yet his pride could not allow him to consider mercy. Thus he made his decision. He would bring her to his palace, under the pretense of honoring her, but in truth, he sought to crush the gift she bore. He would ensure that her voice, the voice that rivaled the strength of his crown, would no longer sing freely. And as he gazed out over his kingdom, where the horizon glowed with the setting sun, he muttered to himself with a clenched jaw, "No one's song shall rise higher than my throne." Would you like me to continue this expansion style for all upcoming outline parts too, bro, keeping the same flow and depth? The news of the summons reached the girl's family at dawn, when a royal messenger arrived on horseback with a scroll sealed by the king's insignia. The village awoke to the thunder of hooves and the glint of bronze armor, and before long, whispers spread like wildfire. The king himself had heard of the girl with the golden voice. Her parents trembled as the words of the decree were read aloud, their hands clutching one another in fear of what such attention from the palace might mean. Some villagers wept quietly, others stared in awe, but all understood that this was not a request, it was a command. To refuse the king was unthinkable, and yet to send their beloved child into the jaws of his jealousy felt like betrayal. Her mother's heart was heavy, her father's shoulders hunched as though the weight of the entire kingdom had fallen upon him. Still, no one dared to speak against the will of the ruler. The girl, however, did not falter. She stood with her small frame yet carried herself with a calmness that made even the messenger glance twice. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet determination, as if she had long known that her gift would one day lead her into the heart of danger. When her mother broke down, clutching her tightly and begging her not to go, the girl gently wiped away her tears and sang a soft melody. The song filled the air like a warm wind, soothing her mother's grief and quieting the panic of the villagers who had gathered. Her voice promised safety even when no one else could guarantee it. She whispered that if her voice was truly given by the spirits, then it could never be silenced by envy. This strength, far beyond her years, stilled the room. Even the messenger, hardened by palace politics, lowered his gaze in respect. Preparations began reluctantly. Her family offered her the only fine cloth they possessed, woven with care but faded by time, to honor her journey. Elders of the village gathered to bless her, sprinkling water drawn from the sacred river onto her forehead, calling upon ancestors to shield her path. Children clung to her hands, refusing to let go until their parents pulled them back, their faces streaked with tears. The girls smiled through it all, singing small fragments of songs that made laughter return to the little ones, as though reminding them that she was still theirs, even as she walked toward the unknown. The journey to the palace was long, and the king's messengers insisted she be escorted under guard, both to ensure her arrival and to display her like a prize. As they traveled across the dusty roads, crowds of people emerged from villages they passed, curious to glimpse the girl whose voice could heal. Each time she sang, whether to ease the weariness of the guards or to comfort a mother carrying a sick child by the roadside, her voice spread like sunlight breaking through clouds. Soldiers hardened by battle softened at her songs, their pace lightened, their tempers soothed. Mothers lifted their children higher to see her, murmuring prayers that her blessings might reach their homes. Word of her journey ran ahead of her, and by the time they neared the palace, she was no longer simply a girl from a small village, she was a living legend in motion. Her family walked with her as far as they were allowed, clinging to her until the gates of the royal city rose in the distance. At that moment, her father's hands lingered on her shoulders, heavy with unspoken words. He could not promise that the king would be merciful, nor could he protect her within those towering walls. The girl placed her small hand over his and sang a song of courage, one that told him that she did not walk alone. The ancestors, the spirits, and the strength of her people walked with her. Her mother, unable to speak, kissed her brow and let her go with tears streaming freely. When at last she entered the grand city, its noise and wealth overwhelmed her senses. Gold-lined gates, bustling markets, towering statues of past rulers, yet despite the grandeur, her gaze did not waver. Where others might have cowered, she walked calmly, her presence drawing the eyes of nobles and commoners alike. Rumors spread in the streets as fast as the wind. The king had summoned the golden voice. Some whispered that she would be praised, others that she would be silenced forever. Yet the girl, though aware of these murmurs, continued forward with steady steps, her song softly humming beneath her breath, a private prayer of resilience. The palace itself loomed ahead, vast and shimmering, its walls high enough to block the horizon. Within its gates lay both splendor and danger, and though her family could no longer follow, their prayers hung in the air like invisible threads binding her to them. The girl paused once before stepping through the massive bronze doors, turning her head as though she could see the faces of her village far behind her. She smiled, lifted her chin, and let a quiet note escape her lips. It echoed gently, rising into the palace halls like a promise that no matter what awaited her inside, she would not forget who she was, nor the gift that carried her. Thus, the summons to the palace was fulfilled, not with trembling footsteps or broken spirit, but with the courage of a child who trusted her gift. She entered the king's world not as a victim but as one who carried within her a power too vast for fear to contain. And though the envy of a ruler shadowed her path, the strength of her voice lit the way forward, steady and unyielding. The palace was vast and glittering, its walls gleaming with gold dust that sparkled in the sunlight. For those who had never seen such wealth, it was a breathtaking sight. But for the girl with the golden voice, those walls were nothing more than a cage waiting to close around her. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the weight of the king's authority pressing down upon her. Guards flanked her on both sides, their spears gleaming, their expressions cold and unreadable. Her heart trembled not for herself, but for her family. She knew that they were in the king's hands, and anything she did here could decide their fate. The king sat upon a throne carved from ivory and inlaid with precious stones. His robes were dyed in the deepest reds, a color reserved only for rulers, and his crown was set with emeralds that caught the light. His eyes, however, were not filled with kindness or admiration. They burned with greed, suspicion, and jealousy. When he looked at the girl, he did not see a child with a gift from the heavens. He saw a threat. "So this is the one," the king said, his voice echoing across the great hall. "The girl whose voice charms the winds and stills the rains. The one who turns quarrels into peace with but a single note. You look ordinary enough. And yet, they whisper that your voice is more powerful than my armies." The girl, though trembling inwardly, lifted her head. Her people had always taught her that fear gave strength to the oppressor. "Great king," she said softly, her voice gentle yet steady, My voice is not a weapon. It is a gift meant to bring healing and joy. It does not seek to rule, only to serve. Her words, though respectful, only deepened the king's bitterness. To him, every word sounded like a challenge. His advisors had already warned him that her gift could grow into a force of loyalty that rivaled his throne. If the people loved her more than they loved him, what use would they have for a king? You speak as though your gift is yours to command, the king sneered. But hear me, child, your voice belongs to me now. From this day forth, you will sing only when I command it and only for me. The people may whisper your name, but they will not hear you again. Their loyalty will return to me when I alone control your song. The girl's heart sank, though her face remained calm. Your Majesty, she said, a voice locked away loses its strength. My gift cannot flourish in chains. It was meant for the ears of many, not for the pleasure of one. The king's expression hardened. He leaned forward, his crown tilting slightly as his anger rose. Do you defy me? His voice shook the hall, and the guards tightened their grip on their spears. Perhaps you forget that your family still lives in my kingdom. Should you refuse me, it will be their suffering that reminds you of your duty. At those words, the girl felt a deep ache within her chest. Images of her mother, her father, her younger brothers and sisters filled her mind. She could not risk their lives. She lowered her head, though her heart remained unbowed. I will sing when you command, O king, she said. The king leaned back, satisfied with her submission. But he did not see the quiet fire that still burned in her eyes. He mistook her obedience for defeat, not knowing that her spirit was far stronger than his greed. That night, the girl was given a chamber within the palace. The room was richly decorated with silken sheets, golden lamps and carved wooden chests. Yet to her, it felt colder than any bare hut. The windows were barred, the doors locked from the outside. Guards were stationed in the corridors to ensure she did not escape. Her songs, once free as the wind, now felt trapped inside her throat. When the king summoned her the next morning, he demanded that she sing for him alone. He reclined on his throne while courtiers fanned him with palm leaves. Sing of my greatness, he commanded. Let your voice praise me above the stars. The girl closed her eyes and sang. Her voice filled the hall like sunlight streaming through a window. It was beautiful, flawless, and pure. But though her melody was sweet, it carried no joy. It praised the king as he had ordered, but behind every word was a quiet sorrow that none could ignore. The courtiers shifted uneasily, some even felt tears welling in their eyes without knowing why. The king, however, heard only what he wanted, the sound of power under his control. Again, he demanded, sing louder. Sing longer. Let the world know that the greatest of all voices belongs to me. And so the days passed. Each morning the girl was summoned to the throne room to sing. Each night she was returned to her gilded prison. The king grew addicted to her voice, summoning her more and more, using her songs to entertain guests, to soothe his sleepless nights, even to boast to visiting rulers. But though he believed he possessed her gift, he did not realize that he was slowly silencing its true power. For the girl sang, but she did not give her heart to the songs. Without love, her voice lost the ability to calm storms or heal wounds. The magic faded with each forced note. The courtiers noticed first. Whispers began to spread that her voice no longer carried the wonder it once did. The king, blind with pride, ignored them. One evening, however, he put her to the test. A village had been struck by drought, and the people begged for rain. The king, eager to prove his control, summoned the girl before the crowd and ordered her to sing the rains down. The girl stood before her people, her heart breaking. She longed to sing freely, to release the gift within her. But the chains of fear, the threats to her family, the king's command, clamped down on her spirit. She opened her mouth, but the song that came forth was weak, hollow, and powerless. The skies remained dry, the earth cracked beneath their feet. The people murmured in despair, and doubt flickered in their eyes. The king's face darkened with rage. Sing again, he roared. Do not shame me before my subjects. The girl tried once more, pouring what strength she could into her song. But the gift, wounded by captivity, refused to answer. The drought remained. The king struck the arm of his throne in fury. You dare make me a fool before my people? He bellowed. His voice boomed across the courtyard, silencing the murmurs. He leaned forward, glaring at the trembling girl. If you will not obey, then your family will suffer first. Their lives hang by the thread of your voice. At that moment, the girl understood the depth of the king's cruelty. He cared nothing for her gift, nothing for the people, nothing even for the throne itself. He cared only for control. And in that realization, a seed of defiance began to grow within her. That night, when she was returned to her chamber, she sat by the barred window and looked out at the moon. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered to the stars, "Great spirits, you gave me this voice not to serve one man but to heal the many. Give me strength to endure until the day I can sing freely once more." And though the night was silent, she felt a warmth within her chest, as though the spirits themselves had heard her plea. From that moment forward, though she sang when commanded, she began to weave quiet rebellion into her songs. Hidden beneath the king's demanded praises, she laced her melodies with notes of sorrow, hope, and defiance. Those who listened closely could hear the truth, that her voice longed to be free, that her spirit had not been broken. The palace air grew heavier with each passing day, thick with the shadows of a king who could not bear to see light shine outside his own command. The girl who had once sung under the open skies where children danced and elders wept from the beauty of her gift, now sat in the dim corridors of stone, her voice chained not by distance but by fear. She was not afraid for herself, her spirit was carved from patience and defiance, but her family, trembling under the gaze of soldiers, weighed upon her heart like a stone. The king's decree was cruel and absolute. She was to sing only for him, for his ears alone, or her loved ones would suffer. And though her heart ached at the injustice, she refused to bend completely, for she knew her voice had never belonged to a single man, no matter how gilded his throne. Word spread quickly through the palace that the girl was defying the king. She sang when she wished, sometimes with notes too faint for human ears, carried like whispers of wind through the carved arches, but never fully at the command of the throne. And this rebellion, small though it seemed, pricked the king's pride deeper than the sharpest spear. In his fury, he summoned his sorcerers, men and women draped in dark robes, with charms and bones dangling from their necks, who lived in the shadowy chambers beneath the palace where the scent of smoke and bitter herbs clung to the air. They bowed low, though their eyes glinted with fear even as they met his gaze. The king's envy was not a quiet thing, it throbbed like a drumbeat that even the walls seemed to hear. "She will not bend," the king thundered, his voice shaking the bronze lamps above. "Then bend her throat. Steal her song if you must. Bind her voice so tightly that even the wind cannot free it." The sorcerers hesitated. It was no small thing to strip a gift woven by spirits into the fabric of a human being. The girl's voice was no ordinary sound, it carried echoes of rivers and mountains, of something older than kings and crowns. To silence such a gift was to meddle with forces beyond mortal reach. Yet the king's eyes were like coals, and they knew refusal was a death sentence. They murmured among themselves in languages older than the kingdom, and one by one they agreed to obey. That night they crept into the girl's chamber. She was not asleep. She sat by the barred window, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the moonlight, as though she were still singing silently to the stars. When the sorcerers entered, the air grew colder. Their charms rattled softly, bones clicking against each other like teeth. "Child," one of them rasped, his voice heavy with pity, "forgive us, for our hands are not ours. They are bound by a king who fears you." She turned to face them, her gaze steady, her spirit unflinching. "Do what you must," she said softly. "But remember, no man, no charm, no chain has ever held the wind. And my voice is the wind." Her words unsettled them, but they pressed on. They laid out their talismans, knots of red thread, stones inscribed with runes, bowls of blackened herbs. They lit fires that sputtered with strange blue flames. Their chants rose and fell like the tide, ancient syllables filling the chamber. Slowly the smoke thickened, swirling around her throat like a tightening noose. The girl felt it, the weight pressing against her windpipe, the tightening grip of charms woven with fear. She tried to hum, to let even a single note escape, but her throat tightened until silence swallowed her. Her lips parted, but nothing came. The air pressed against her chest, but the song that lived inside her refused to move past her lips. Her gift, so freely given to the world, was now locked within her like a bird trapped in a cage. For days she could not utter a word. The palace grew strangely still, as though it too missed the sound that had once filled its halls with echoes of freedom. The king strutted through his chambers with satisfaction, but deep inside, unease gnawed at him. Silence was not the victory he had expected. He had stolen her song, yes, but with it he had stolen the life from his palace. The fountains no longer seemed to sparkle, the gardens no longer felt alive, and even the courtiers whispered less. It was as though her silence had infected the walls themselves, stripping the kingdom of joy. The girl, though bound, did not despair. She carried her silence like a cloak, walking with her head high. In the palace gardens, servants whispered about her, how she still smiled with her eyes, how the wind seemed to stir around her when she walked, lifting leaves and petals as though listening for the voice trapped within. Some swore that when she touched a flower, it trembled with an unheard melody. Others said her silence was louder than any song, for it carried defiance. The sorcerers, meanwhile, grew restless. They began to dream at night of rivers roaring, of forests whispering in voices they could not silence. They saw visions of the girl's throat glowing like a forge, as if her voice burned hotter in captivity. One of them confessed in secret, "We did not silence her. We only pressed her voice deeper into the earth, and the earth itself is restless." The king ignored their warnings. He relished the girl's quiet presence at his feasts, where she sat like a caged jewel, mute and shining. He would lean close and whisper, "See? Even the spirits bow to me. Even the wind obeys." But when he looked into her eyes, he never saw fear, only something that unsettled him, something like patience, as if she were waiting for the right moment to remind him that no silence lasts forever. Outside the palace, whispers spread. Villagers missed the girl's songs, and they began to gather at night to hum the melodies she once sang. Her silence, instead of erasing her gift, multiplied it. Her songs lived on in the voices of the people, passed from mouth to mouth, carried on the wind she had once commanded. The more the king tried to bury her voice, the more it bloomed across the land like wildflowers breaking through stone. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a storm rose from the east. The winds howled like a choir, shaking the palace walls. The girl stood at her window, feeling the pull in her chest, the ache of a song that longed to escape. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating her face. For a moment, the sorcerers below felt their charms tremble, as though the storm itself demanded her voice back. She closed her eyes, and though no sound left her lips, the storm seemed to answer. Thunder rolled in patterns that echoed her forgotten melodies, and rain fell with rhythms like drumbeats. The king, startled, shouted at the heavens, commanding the storm to stop, but the storm obeyed no man. It roared louder, shaking the palace to its foundations, until the king cowered in his chamber, muttering that perhaps the silence he forced was not victory but curse. The girl remained calm, her silence now a force greater than sound. The sorcerers, pale with fear, began to understand what they had done. By binding her voice, they had not destroyed her gift. They had awakened something deeper, something that even they could not control. They whispered among themselves that her silence was not emptiness but a seed, waiting to burst forth with power the king could never hope to contain. And the girl, though muted, knew. Her silence had been long and heavy, stretching over days that felt like years. The palace, once a place of uneasy calm, had become a nest of unrest. But on that night, as the storm raged outside, the heavens themselves seemed to know her heart could no longer bear the weight of silence. Rain crashed against the roofs, wind howled through the corridors, and thunder rolled so loudly it felt as though the sky itself was tearing apart. She fell to her knees on the cold floor, her body trembling not from fear, but from the burden that had been locked in her chest since the day her voice was stolen. Her hands clawed at the ground, her face pressed to the earth as if begging the ancestors themselves for release. Her lips parted, and at first there was nothing, only the sound of her broken sobs swallowed by the thunder. But then it came, not a song, not the beautiful melody the world had once envied, but a raw cry, a sound born of pain and fury, of loss and resistance. That cry was unlike anything the palace had ever heard. It was not a human sound, nor entirely of this world. It was deep, primal, and filled with centuries of voices that seemed to flow through her. The charms around her throat, the invisible chains woven by the king's sorcerers, began to quiver at the sound. They hissed and crackled like fire meeting rain, straining to hold against the force erupting from within her. But her cry rose higher, breaking through the storm's roar, echoing against the palace walls until it seemed the stones themselves might collapse. The thunder outside grew louder, responding as if the skies recognized her call. With each note of her cry, the sorcery tightened painfully, as though trying to strangle her into silence once more, but her spirit refused to bow. The palace trembled. Dust fell from the ceilings, torches flickered violently, and guards who had long mocked her covered their ears in terror. The cry was not simply heard, it was felt, a vibration that rattled bones and pierced hearts. The charms binding her shattered one by one, sparks of dark magic flying into the air before fading into smoke. The final charm, a band of cursed energy around her throat, resisted the longest. It pulsed and glowed like molten iron, squeezing until her breath faltered. Her body convulsed, but she forced her cry to grow louder, pouring every drop of her soul into it. And then with a sound like glass breaking, the final bond snapped. The energy exploded outward, crashing against the walls, sending cracks running across the marble as though the building itself was splitting open. The storm outside answered her freedom. Lightning struck a tree in the courtyard, setting it ablaze, and the thunder rolled again, so loud it made the ground quake. The wind surged into the palace, blowing open doors and windows as though the ancestors themselves were marching inside to witness her release. The girl collapsed forward, her chest heaving, her throat burning from the force of her cry, but her voice was free. She touched her neck with trembling hands and felt no bindings, only the steady pulse of her own strength returning. Tears blurred her vision, not of sorrow this time, but of defiance, of knowing that even magic woven in cruelty could not cage what was meant to be eternal. The soldiers who had grown arrogant in her silence cowered in the halls, their weapons clattering to the ground. Servants whispered prayers, unsure if they had just witnessed a miracle or a curse. Even the king from his chamber felt the tremor that shook his throne. His goblet spilled wine across the floor as the cry reached his ears. For the first time since binding her, he felt fear, not of rebellion, not of enemies beyond his gates, but of her, the girl he had tried to silence. She had broken through power meant to be unbreakable. Her cry lingered long after the storm began to ease, resonating through the palace like the toll of a sacred drum. It was not beauty that shook the walls, nor melody, but truth, raw, undeniable, and untamed. And as the echoes died, the silence that followed was no longer the silence of chains, but the silence of awe, of fear, of reverence. The girl rose slowly to her feet, her hair clinging to her wet face, her body still trembling, but her spirit burning brighter than the storm outside. She was no longer the silenced one. She was the voice that had shattered walls, charms, and hearts in a single breath. And the palace knew it would never be the same again. When the girl's cry rose into the storm, it was not only the palace walls that trembled but the very soul of the king himself. The sound struck him like a spear hurled from the heavens, piercing deeper than any blade forged by men. He clutched his head, staggering backward as though unseen hands were pulling at his spirit. His ears rang first with a sharp whistle, then with an unbearable roar, as if every forgotten voice of justice and every silenced cry of the oppressed had been released all at once. Blood trickled from his ears, staining his regal garments, and his crown slipped from his head, clattering uselessly against the stone floor. The servants gasped, soldiers dropped their spears, and even the storm seemed to pause as though it too watched the king meet his reckoning. He screamed, or at least he tried, but nothing came, no words, no sound, only the gurgle of breath from a throat stripped of power. The ancestors, unseen but deeply present, had marked him guilty of daring to bind what was never his to control. They judged him not as a ruler but as a thief who tried to chain a divine gift meant to flow free. His voice, the tool he had used to command, deceive, and oppress, was ripped from him forever. He opened his mouth again and again, but only silence escaped, a silence more damning than any prison cell. The council, once obedient and fearful, now looked at him with a mixture of awe and terror. The same man who had commanded armies, silenced dissent, and built walls of fear around his throne was now voiceless, stripped bare before those he once crushed under his rule. Whispers grew quickly among the servants and guards, carried like wildfire in the palace halls. Some said the ancestors had cursed him, others whispered that justice itself had finally answered the girl's suffering. The very men who once obeyed his every order now exchanged glances, questioning whether a king without a voice could remain a king at all. The girl stood, her tears glistening on her cheeks, her body trembling from the force of what had just been unleashed. Yet her silence now carried no burden, no weight of chains. She did not need to speak, the power of her voice had already judged, already punished. Her eyes, filled with the strength of generations past, fixed upon the broken figure of the king. He cowered, his lips moving desperately, his body shaking as though he could beg for forgiveness. But forgiveness did not come. Only silence answered him. The same silence he had forced upon her now wrapped itself around his life, choking away the last fragments of his pride. The palace that had once echoed with his speeches and commands now echoed with the memory of her cry. The walls themselves seemed to hum with the remnants of her voice, a resonance that no hand could erase. Where once the king's authority had stood firm, there was now only fragility, a man broken by the very gift he had tried to enslave. Some guards turned their backs on him, unable to bear the sight of their ruler reduced to a husk. Others stared coldly, waiting for the council to decide his fate. Outside, the storm raged on, but within those walls, a deeper storm had passed judgment. The king's punishment was not death, though some thought it a mercy he no longer deserved. His punishment was life without the very thing he had worshipped most: control through voice. He would live, but voiceless, powerless, haunted by the echo of the cry that had torn his world apart. Each day he would hear it in his mind, the reminder of his guilt, the sound of justice too powerful for any throne to withstand. And each night, when he closed his eyes, the silence would remind him that his legacy was not that of a ruler, but of a man condemned by the ancestors for daring to silence the chosen. Thus, in the halls of the palace, his downfall became a tale whispered with reverence and fear. For the people knew the truth, that no king, no matter how mighty, could chain a divine gift without paying the ultimate price. The girl's cry had not only shattered walls, but it had shattered the illusion of his eternal reign, leaving him nothing but a voiceless shadow in the ruins of his own arrogance. The storm still raged outside, but within the palace, silence fell after the cry and the king's collapse. That silence did not last. Whispers began among the guards, first as cautious murmurs, then as bold words spoken with trembling conviction. They had seen the girl fall to her knees, they had heard her cry that shattered charms and shook stone, and they had watched their king, a man they once thought untouchable, reduced to a broken shell on the floor, his voice stolen from him. For years they had obeyed him because of fear, because of the weight of his words, because his voice had been the instrument through which his power ruled. Now, stripped of that voice, he was just a man, and a weak one at that. Slowly, the guards who had once been ready to raise their spears against the girl lowered them instead, their eyes reflecting awe and recognition. The villagers who had gathered outside the palace to seek shelter from the storm felt the tremor in the earth, heard the echo of her cry, and rushed forward. They pushed through the palace gates, which no longer seemed to resist them. For the first time, they entered the king's hall without fear of punishment, their feet pounding against floors that had been forbidden to them. They came expecting to see the throne as a place of glory, but what they found was a king on his knees, bleeding and powerless, and a girl standing in the center of the hall, her tears still on her cheeks but her presence glowing with something divine. They did not need to be told what this meant. The ancestors themselves had spoken through her. The guards, torn between their duty to the king and the truth they had witnessed, began to turn. One by one, they bowed their heads not to their fallen ruler but to the girl. Villagers followed, dropping to their knees, raising their hands in reverence and calling her the chosen one. It was not just obedience, it was belief. They saw her as a vessel of the ancestors, a living testament that no man, not even a king, could enslave a divine gift. The chains that had bound them in silence for years, the fear of punishment, the weight of forced obedience, fell away as they looked upon her. For the first time they felt what true freedom meant. The king tried to rise, his lips moving but no sound coming out. He clawed at the air, desperate to command, to curse, to threaten. But his silence was louder than any word he could have spoken. The people saw him for what he was, not a protector, not a leader chosen by divine will, but a man who had stolen power and clung to it by fear. Without his voice there was no crown, no authority, no command strong enough to bind them anymore. His silence was his undoing, and it gave the people courage. The villagers began to speak openly, their words rising like a flood. "She is chosen," some cried. "The ancestors stand with her," others shouted. The guards who once enforced silence now found themselves joining in, their chants echoing in the great hall. The walls that had trembled at her cry now echoed with the sound of a people awakening, their voices no longer suppressed but free and unafraid. What had once been the king's fortress of control was turning into the people's sanctuary of freedom. As they gathered around her, some reached out to touch the hem of her garment, others simply bowed in reverence, and a few wept openly, knowing they had witnessed a moment that would be told for generations. They no longer saw her as just a girl who had been silenced, but as a bridge between their world and the spirits. She had endured suffering, humiliation, and enchantments meant to break her, yet she had risen above it with a power not her own but gifted through her faith and pain. The king, forgotten by his people, was left crouched in the corner of his own hall, clutching at his throat while the chants of the villagers rose higher. The more they called out to the girl, the smaller he seemed, until he was nothing more than a shadow of authority that had once held sway over them. His crown slipped from his head, clattering against the floor, and no one moved to pick it up. The symbol of his power had lost all meaning. In that moment the people knew something greater had begun. They had lived under a reign of fear, but fear no longer had a hold on them. The girl had awakened not just their courage but their collective spirit. The palace guards, once the hand of the king's cruelty, now pledged to protect her. The villagers, who had been forced into silence, lifted their voices together. It was not rebellion. It was transformation. The people were no longer subjects. They were free, and they owed that freedom to the cry that had broken chains and the girl who had carried it. The storm outside began to ease, the thunder rolling into silence as if even the skies acknowledged the shift. Within the palace walls, the air felt lighter, as though centuries of oppression had been lifted in a single night. The people's awakening was complete, and with it the king's reign ended, not by sword or fire, but by the power of a cry that shook walls and stirred hearts. They knew the ancestors had spoken, and their answer was clear. The true strength of a people lay not in fear but in unity, and their unity had been reborn through her.